Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden have agreed that South Africa will require more funding to achieve an effective, just transition. The two leaders met in Washington to discuss the climate crisis, trade and the conflict in Ukraine, among other topics. Regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Ramaphosa has refrained from criticizing it, while South Africa has generally maintained its neutrality throughout the conflict. To discuss the significance of this meeting at a time like this, we're joined by Daily Maverick editor and a former U.S. Ambassador Brooks Spector. Brooks, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Let me just correct that slightly. I was not an ambassador. I was a diplomat, but not an. You only get one ambassador per country.
This is true. Thank you so much for that. Well, let's talk about the meeting. We know that, under former U.S. President Donald Trump, that U.S. foreign policy, in fact, suffered in Africa. He rarely took time out to pay much attention to the continent. But we have this meeting of these two leaders, President Cyril Ramaphosa and U.S. President Joe Biden, seemingly successful. What are your thoughts in terms of the relations between the two countries? Were those strengthened by this recent visit?
Well, I think let's start with this. The relationship was not weakened by the meeting. The relationship did not become more acrimonious. The relationship did not become more tension-filled or stressed or strained. That in itself is already an accomplishment, given the fact that there is a serious, deep, almost fundamental disagreement between the two countries about the way in which South Africa should respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, given the fact that that was kept out of infecting all of the other discussion topics is no mean feat all by itself. But let's also be clear that there were no major breakthroughs. In other words, there are not giant initiatives or massive changes being made either, because this was not, after all, a state visit with treaties being signed and bands playing and state dinners and all the rest. This was a working visit. This was two leaders who have every reason to find common ground, sitting down together, having a cup of coffee, perhaps maybe some nibbles, and reaching an understanding that they disagree on some things and agree on others. I think it's crucially important to underscore the idea that they both talked significantly about climate change issues and about economic issues, specifically trade between the U.S. and Africa, investment in Africa, and things of that order. Those are important topics at the bilateral level, and they quite clearly had a chance to have that conversation.
We'll circle back to the climate crisis issue, but on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you talk about the two countries potentially finding some kind of common ground. How would that be possible given the divide that we see with the two positions that they hold? We have South Africa that has refused to criticize what Russia has done, but has called for some sort of dialogue to begin so that we can edge closer to brokering some kind of a peace deal between the two countries, while on the other hand, the U.S. has been a part of a coalition of Western countries to impose economic sanctions on Russia. Clearly two very different positions. How does one engage in a conversation and find some sort of commonality when we're coming from two opposing sides here, or two differing sides at least?
Yeah, the key is that you don't come to a common agreement. You don't come to a 50-50 split the difference. You agree to disagree. You agree to make your points strongly, but you also agree that that is one of among many things to talk about. And we're just going to have to say that we disagree on point A. Now let's move on to point B. We think you're wrong on point A, but we have other topics in limited time, and we have to talk about them as well. It's a shame, I think. South Africa's voice could be helpful. India and China both have, after all, expressed some muttering, some demurs about the Russian policy, the Russian invasion in the last number of days. And South Africa's voice could have been very helpful. but that's not to be, at least not yet. So they did agree on some issues that are important, and they apparently chose to disagree on one that is a serious cause, serious question from the American perspective, perhaps less so from the South African one.
Well, on the issue of climate change, Brooks, we know that this is very topical, given the fact that we're, edging closer to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where we know that countries and heads of states will, of course, be discussing the all-important issue of climate change. What could possibly come from this meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and President Cyril Ramaphosa on the climate issue, given the fact that Africa, as a continent, sort of dispenses a fraction of the, global gas emissions that we've seen over the years. And there's been a lot of criticism around developed countries and how they've responded to the climate crisis and the sort of calls and, requests that have been put on underdeveloped countries who have contributed far less to the climate crisis that we see today.
Well, 2 points to start with. The single largest emitter of carbon gases into the atmosphere now is China, and the United States finally, its Congress passed a measure which will contribute significantly, if not crucially, but certainly significantly, to lessening the American output of such gases over the next number of years. So that puts the U.S. in a better position on this topic than it would have been, say, a year ago at this time. By the same token, the agreement to provide funds to South Africa, among other countries, to help abate the transition from one type of energy production to others, the discussion now appears to be more not whether such funding should occur, but what is the mix of the funding? How much should be grants? How much should be long-term loans? Should that percentage go up or down? That's a negotiating question as opposed to a fundamental disagreement. I think it's generally understood, I think, by most global leaders that we are all in the soup together. There's no escaping this particular soup bowl, climate change. African nations may have the argument that they make, as you put it, about the relative lack of polluting gas production, but there are some countries, especially small islands, nations in the Pacific, that have an even more immediate question. That is, the very nature of their countries are threatened as climate changes and the oceans rise, and so I think they're even more in the front line than anybody else. But what has happened in the discussion between the two presidents is agreement that more pressure, more involvement, more engagement is still necessary, because, as we all know, the climate is changing, the atmospheric temperature globally is rising, and if we stay on the course we're on now, we're headed for a very unpleasant circumstance.
With the talks of some sort of a just energy transition package or some sort of funding from developed countries, South Africa being a part of that, would that open doors or windows of even more applied pressure from developed countries on, say, South Africa to fast-track its transition? I think there's a lot of concern or perhaps a little anxiety over what sort of terms and conditions would come with a package or a funding of the size, essentially.
Well, there are always going to be contentious issues when external sources are providing the funding. They're going to have one set of views about how such funding should be structured, and the receiving country or countries obviously will have a different set of perceptions, and the question now is figuring out the median point in which everybody, if not is not happy, but at least is in agreement. The real question to me is not dickering over what percentage is loans versus grants. The real question is commitment to make it happen in the first place. and then you can begin to renegotiate or negotiate the terms and conditions as things go along. One thing that needs to happen domestically in South Africa is a serious understanding about the need to not add more coal-fired plants to the energy production mix. That, I think, is crucial, and so far, at least, the government commitment to that seems to be less than, shall we say, convincing.
All right, Brooks, so thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on our program this morning and helping us to unpack that recent visit that Ramaphosa had in the U.S. That is Daily Maverick editor Brooks Spector. Onto this now, the Queen.